The U.S. Pakistan relationship was already going downhill prior to the death of bin Laden. After 2010, when the U.S. increased forces in Afghanistan, relations began to deteriorate, and they dropped quite a bit further following the Raymond Davis incident. And of course, the bin Laden raid in May brought them to, I think, probably a new low since 9/11. And they continue to be quite tense, I think is fair to say. Both sides are not prepared to walk away from the relationship, but I think are beginning to reassess what the nature of that relationship should be on a going forward basis. Of course, it's significant that he was killed in Pakistan. There's been suspicions for quite some time that the top leadership was on the Pakistani side of the border, and that is, one of the main sticking points vis-a-vis the bilateral relationship between the two countries. In terms of drone strikes from a wider perspective, this is exactly the type of drone strike that I think the U.S. should be executing. It was against a high-value target. It's going to have significant impact at an operational and probably also a strategic level within al-Qaeda. He was not only responsible for liaising on an operational level with a lot of different outfits, but he was also somebody, I think, more significantly, who was attuned to concerns about violence against Muslims. So that is a strategic debate going on within al-Qaeda right now. So on a whole host of levels, this is exactly the type of drone strike that I think the U.S. should be doing. That said, a lot of the drone strikes that have been carried out, at least as far as we can determine from the open source evidence, which is often quite difficult to gather, have targeted much lower level operatives. And there is a question in terms of whether the benefits of those strikes outweigh the costs in terms of anger from the Pakistani populace, tensions within the bilateral relationship, and the fact that, whether or not those strikes are killing civilians, they are perceived to be, and therefore may be creating more foot soldiers. The U.S. foreign policy towards Pakistan goes beyond just cooperation in terms of counterterrorism, although that is a very important component of it. There's also regional diplomatic initiatives in Afghanistan. There are counterproliferation issues that the U.S. needs to be concerned about. And then there's the wider issue of regional stability, with which Pakistan plays a major part, particularly because of the tense India-Pakistan relationship. So our foreign policy vis-a-vis Pakistan needs to go beyond, as I said, just the perspective of counterterrorism. But of course, it will continue to be predominated in large part by security concerns of the various types that I just laid out. Over time, my sense is that the regional stability will benefit and U.S. interests in the region will benefit if Pakistan is able to improve its own economic performance, its civilian governance, to improve its infrastructure. All of these things the U.S. does have interests in. Civilian aid should continue for several reasons. One, because it is an important way of signaling that the U.S. will continue to maintain a relationship with Pakistan over the long term. And that is something that is very important for putting, I think, Pakistani concerns at ease, and is also an important message to send to the populace. More importantly, or equally importantly, is the fact that civilian is important for building governance mechanisms and helping to straighten out Pakistan's economy and stabilize it to the degree possible. Now, military aid is a different story. I would argue that military aid package needs to be restructured, that unilateral metrics, while we may feel, the U.S. may feel, that it has the right to dictate those terms, Pakistan disagrees. And I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be metrics, that we shouldn't, that aid shouldn't be conditioned, but rather that we may have a more fruitful relationship if the U.S. and Pakistan negotiated what those indicators should be and what those metrics should be. And that might lead to a scaling back of aid. But that's something that I think that both sides need to work out together. Of course, right now, given the state of the relationship, I don't know if there's stomach on either side for a constructive engagement along those lines. In terms of our military aid package, I think it would be quite useful if there were a greater focus on civilian intelligence agencies and civilian law enforcement, and that part of any aid package to the military should be contingent upon that aid for civilian intelligence, civilian law enforcement being accepted, and that goes also to the degree that our civilian trainers should be able to work with their civilian agencies. Yes. The security establishment continues to play a double game. That's been happening since 9/11. Now, that double game is important because it is two games. It is not just that the Pakistanis are continuing to support some outfits and aren't doing some of the things that the U.S. would like them to do. It is important to remember that the U.S. is getting assistance in certain areas. Supplies continue to transit through Pakistan into Afghanistan. Even though counterterrorism cooperation has suffered since the Raymond Davis affair and then particularly the bin Laden raid, it hasn't completely ceased. The U.S. has the largest diplomatic mission there, so there are, the relationship could certainly decline further as bad as it is right now. So yes, does a double game continue? Absolutely, but that means that we are getting some cooperation. We're just not getting nearly as much as we like. U.S. and Pakistan have different perspectives in terms of what it's going to take to ensure their security, and that is certainly true in terms of how the U.S. and how Pakistan view certain militant groups on its soil. While they can agree on the need for action against outfits like Pakistani Taliban or al-Qaeda, there is a significant divergence in terms of groups like the Haqqani Network and Lashkar-e-Taiba. Those groups are not at the organizational level attacking the Pakistani state, and they continue to serve a purpose for Pakistan geopolitically as a balance against India, whereas the U.S. sees them as a significant security threat. And that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the divergences that take place. It's going to be very difficult to rebuild the trust deficit, but one of the things that's going to be necessary is a franker exchange about what each side can and cannot expect from the other. A lot of or at least some of the travails that the relationship has suffered has been, I would submit, as a result of unrealistic expectations on both sides. There are several Pakistani outfits that have the capability to launch a strike against the U.S. Whether they could do so unilaterally or collaboratively is, of course, very difficult to determine. Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan has already attempted an attack against the U.S. last year. Lashkar-e-Taiba has probably the most robust transnational networks of these groups. It has trained U.S. operatives in the past, but its intent its intention to attack the U.S. is less clear. It's under significant pressure from the ISI, it appears, not to launch strikes against the U.S. I mean, when I was just in Pakistan, make of this, what you will, I've had a number of military and intelligence officials say to me, listen, you think we don't understand the stakes involved if LET hits America, and they really seem to. The question is, what are they prepared to do about that? The approach thus far has been to try to keep Lashkar-e-Taiba under control, to keep the organization from striking the U.S. Homeland or U.S. or allied interests in Europe or in the region. Again, having just had conversations with a number of people from law enforcement, from various militant groups, journalists in Pakistan, one of the things that I think is cause for concern is the degree to which this control over the leadership translates to control over mid-level commanders and the rank and file. And that goes to the concerns about a collaborative strike of some nature or an unsanctioned attack by one of these groups that the Pakistani ISI is attempting to keep in a box. Pakistan has been suffering from terrorism attacks and an insurgency in the tribal areas since before 2007, but certainly since 2007, 2008. There's been a steady drumbeat of attacks. These increase and decrease often in the heartland, in Punjab province and elsewhere in Pakistan, based on what's happening in the tribal areas. One of the things that I was looking at when I was just in Pakistan is the role that the band outfits that were initially headquartered and grew out of Punjab province play in this. And it's quite apparent that several things are happening. The first is that there's a rise of a new generation of militants who are tied to these outfits or to these networks, but aren't under the control of the leadership the way some in the older generation is. The second thing that's happening is you've had some people from these groups leave and go form splinter outfits or become part of new networks. And they are also able to make use of the infrastructure that existed in the past. And then the third thing that's happening is you have completely independent actors who are often involved in criminality and may transition over to jihadism. There's an economic interest in this as well, such that one sees warlordism and jihadism often overlapping, particularly in the tribal areas. In terms of Pakistani perceptions and what can be done about this, one of the things that I was struck by in talking with security officials and law enforcement is that there's a real disconnect within the establishment, as it were, over whether this is an existential problem or not. There are those who are working at the ground level who see it as a major threat that needs to be rolled back. But there are others who believe that this is manageable and that the way to avoid inflaming that threat is to avoid going after those groups that haven't turned their guns on the Pakistani state, even when the infrastructure belonging to those groups is being used for attacks against the Pakistani state. And so that's a real debate. And until that debate is resolved, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to have a long-term lasting solution. Instead it will be a question of managing violence rather than ending it. Part and parcel to that is also, of course, debates about what de-radicalization would look like in Pakistan. I was at a conference on de-radicalization, and while the army and the civilian government and NGOs are to be commended for working to de-radicalize individuals who are part of the insurgency in SWAT, there as yet appears to be no real plan in place for demobilizing some of the extant organizations and movements in the country. There are different schools of thought in terms of how a troop withdrawal is going to impact the U.S. Pakistan relationship. On the one hand, as more troops are withdrawn from Afghanistan, the need for supplies to move through into Pakistan decreases, and that's one of the areas where the Pakistanis have leverage over the U.S. If there is some sort of a political settlement, even if some troops remain in Afghanistan, then and that settlement is one that is acceptable to the Pakistanis, then that could also potentially, reorder or change their calculus vis-a-vis some of the insurgent movements that are currently enjoying sanctuary on their soil. The flip side, of course, is Pakistani concerns about an Afghanistan that is out of control. And part of their support for some of these insurgent movements stems not just from a desire to see an Afghanistan that is friendly to Pakistan, but one that is also stable, and their belief at least publicly stated to me, when I'm there, that they need to have, their own dog in the fight, in case things devolve after the U.S. withdrawal. So on the one hand, we don't want the U.S. to leave because we don't want instability. On the other hand, if the U.S. would just leave Afghanistan, then everything would be better. And of course, we won't know the answer to that until the troop withdrawal actually takes place. And a lot of that will also be dependent on how many troops are left in the country, and on the degree to which a political settlement is possible to attain. The U.S. and Pakistan are going to need to continue to cooperate on counterterrorism, probably whether they'd like to or not. From the U.S. perspective, it can degrade the terrorist infrastructure in Pakistan, and it can work with allies outside of Pakistan to interdict some of those who are trying to get training there or are trying to leave to come back to do attacks. But the U.S. cannot dismantle that infrastructure on its own, and it's going to need Pakistan's cooperation to do it. On the flip side, while the Pakistanis have improved in terms of their counterinsurgency efforts, that has been in large part due to both financial, technological, and training assistance from the U.S. Counterterrorism, on the other hand, particularly from a law enforcement perspective, lags far behind. And that's the type of capabilities that Pakistan is going to need to protect itself in the mainland, because the army isn't going to be deployed in Punjab province. The army can be deployed to the tribal areas to pacify things there, with mixed results at this stage. But it can't be deployed in Punjab province, and so if there were a spike in attacks there, that's something that the police are going to need to manage, along with civilian intelligence agencies to a large degree. And in that area, it will continue to need security assistance from the U.S. So both sides are going to need to continue to work with one another, probably whether they like it or not.